In the last module, we talked about really the basics when you start defining a security structure from a Dynamics 365 perspective. And we talked about how you're going to use business units and how you're going to use security roles in combination with those business units to define what specific privileges and access levels that people might have. And one of the big things that we saw in that last module was everything works within the context of business units. It's all based upon who you are and what business unit you belong to. And in most situations, that does allow for a combination of most security instances that you might have. Sometimes, though, you run into situations where the business unit structure just isn't always going to fit. And so that's where you can use different options to be able to maybe extend that existing CRM security model out to have a little bit more granular access. And that's where this concept of what is called hierarchical security comes into play. And so what we want to do in this module is talk just a little bit about what is Dynamics 365 hierarchical security, how does it differ from kind of your existing security module or options that you would see inside a Dynamics 365 implementation. And it's really not different as much as it is complementary. It's a kind of an additional security piece that you can bring on top of it. So we're going to look at what that is. We'll talk a little bit about how it's configured and what some of the options are for configuration. And then we'll talk about the two options that play into fact when you start talking about hierarchical security, and that's the managerial security as well as the positional security. And each one of those can now be used to kind of extend your existing security structure out and just accommodate a few more options as you're moving forward. So as we talked about on the first slide, what is hierarchical security? And really it's an extension of the existing Dynamics 365 security model. And it allows you a little bit more granular access to records, because what it basically does is it looks at who you are and where your position is within the company's hierarchy of your organization. So before we kind of get into the configuration and talk about it, let's look at it from a kind of a typical organization where you have like your C-level executives. Those C-level executives might have managers that report to them, and then those managers might have salespeople that report to them. So when you start talking about having access, it would make sense that as a C-level executive, I should be able to see and maybe even to some degree manipulate most of the information that my sales managers have access to that they're working with. So I would have read-write access to all of my sales manager information. Well, since my sales managers have people that report to them, ultimately they're part of that hierarchy, I should at least have visibility into what those other people are doing. And so from a managerial standpoint, it doesn't necessarily look at it as much at an entity level as it does look at it who you are and who you supervise as part of your organization. Now, it's not a replacement to the existing business unit security model. It's kind of an extension on that. You have to use it in conjunction with the existing business unit options that you would be working with. But on top of that, now you say, okay, I want this to be used, and based upon what my position is within the organization, I want to have additional visibility into all of my subordinates' accounts, contacts, opportunities, so on and so forth. And so it's an easier way to apply permission to a bunch of different entities without having to go in and specifically assign privileges and options. Now, it's an opt-in feature. So as you can see here on the screen, it's something that you really have to opt in for. So you have to go in and enable hierarchical security modeling at an application level. There's two options, and we'll talk about both of these here in just a couple of seconds. There's managerial hierarchy, and then there's custom position hierarchy. You can only use one or the other. Managerial is based upon who the manager is for a specific record. Custom position hierarchy is based upon a new entity called positions that is associated with each user in the deployment. So you have to define who's managers of who or what position people have within your organization. And then each one of these options has kind of a depth option that you can set. So from within the organization, I can say, okay, that I want a hierarchy to go down 3 levels. So I've got C levels, I got C execs, I've got managers, and I've got individual people. Those are my 3 tiers. It does support up to 100 different levels. What we usually tell people around the hierarchical security stuff is try to keep it at no more than 4. And we'll talk about why that is as we move through, but you can start to see a little bit of a performance issue when you start moving forward. Now, each one of these, as you're enabling these, will actually basically give you access to all of the subsequent entities inside the application. You also have the ability to exclude entities from the hierarchy, and I'll show you that when we get into some of the individualized situations as well. Let's look at each one of the manager and positional hierarchies in a little bit more detail. So from a managerial perspective, the manager has to reside in the same business unit or the parent business unit of the people or person that they are directly or indirectly managing. So for example, if I am working with subordinate people and I need access to all of their stuff, I at least have to be in the parent business unit of the item that I'm working with. It follows that same business unit model structure that you'd be working with. Positional is a little bit different. Positional doesn't use a direct report model. What it actually does is it has a position that is associated with each person. And each one of those positions has kind of a direct and indirect report associated with them. And what's nice about the positional security is you can go across business units and you can go into different areas. So they do extend the existing security model. Managerial still honors some of that same kind of business unit structure as far as parent-child access, whereas positional is going to give you more access to expand across different business units. And we'll talk, like I said, a little bit about each one of these in a little bit more detail. But again, you have to kind of choose which one you want to use, if any, because you only have one option when you are implementing hierarchical security. Either manager or positional, you can't use both. If you elect to go the managerial route from a security standpoint, the big thing to remember is it uses more of kind of a direct reporting structure. And so it's all based on the manager field on the system user entity inside Dynamics 365. So for example, if you look at kind of the visual here, we have this concept of the VP of sales. And so the VP of sales is going to have direct reports that report directly to them, which in this case would be sales managers. And so from an application perspective, the VP of sales really should have access from a editable perspective to all of their direct reports. So the sales managers would be considered a direct report. So because of that, as the VP of sales, you're going to have the ability to edit, read, append to, basically work with and manipulate all of your direct reports information. Now, underneath your direct reports, like you can see for the sales managers, we have one of the sales managers that has a sales staff that's associated with them. Well, those still technically in line with that VP of sales hierarchy. So I should still have access to their data. Now, I'm not necessarily going to have direct edit access to their information because technically they are not a direct report, they're a non-direct report. So I am only going to be able to see the information for the sales users. And so what we would do in this managerial type situation is you would go out and define for each person within your organization, this person's manager is this person's manager is this person, and you define that all the way up the chain. And so anybody who's directly underneath you, you can modify and edit their information, and then subsequently anybody who falls underneath those people are considered a non-direct report. So you have visibility, you just don't necessarily have edit capabilities. So let's look at this inside the app. So if I go into settings and security, I'm going to go into hierarchical security or hierarchy security. And we're just going to kind of configure this first at kind of a managerial level, and then we'll go ahead and look at it in another demo from a positional standpoint. So the first thing that we're going to do when this opens up is we have to enable the functionality inside the application. And once the functionality is enabled, then we have to kind of define what model we're going to use. So in here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to enable hierarchy security. And I'm going to configure or set this up from kind of a managerial hierarchy standpoint. So this is where I can go in and I can hit configure, and this is going to take me into the application where I can now start to kind of define what this option is. So this is each user within the organization. So let's just, for example, open up Tony. So we're going to say that from Tony's perspective, Tony's manager is myself maybe. So we'll go ahead and we'll scroll down into here. Let's switch this to user. And right here underneath the organization information is the manager. So we're going to say that Tony's manager is myself. Then we'll go ahead and save the changes. And then I can go ahead and close out of here. And then we'll say that from myself, my manager is the CRM admin. So we'll go ahead and open up my user record, scroll down into my user information, and set the manager as CRM admin. So now, from this application perspective, the CRM admin is going to have the ability to edit and modify any of my information based upon the managerial hierarchy, and I'm going to have that same access to Tony's. The CRM admin is going to have read-only access to Tony's information because he's in the same hierarchy. He is considered an indirect report. And that's really what you would do from a configuration perspective inside the app. Now, this is where the hierarchy option comes into play. I have the depth set to 3. You would normally, depending upon how you want to go through, up to 100 is what your options are, but as I mentioned, you really want to target more about 4. And the reason behind that is think about how many records each one of those individual people could have. Tony could have 15 or 20 different records that he has to work with. And if I've got 5 or 6 different people that I manage, now that's, 20 times 5 or 6, now you're getting into 100 different records. And if the CRM admin now has 10 or 15 people that they manage, now you start multiplying all those together and you can see that it's very easily getting into the thousands of records that this additional level of security has to be applied to, which then means that you could potentially have some slight performance issues, particularly when you start getting higher up in the hierarchy. So now your C-level people trying to look at information could experience slowdowns. So keep that targeted right in about the 4 area if you can. Now the other thing is, by default, I am going to have access to all of Tony's information. If there's specific entities in here that I don't want somebody to have access to, this is where I could select that entity, add it to the excluded entities, and now that removes it from the hierarchy. So the nice thing about the hierarchy is I'm getting direct access and the ability to work with all of those information for anybody who reports directly to me. From a positional standpoint is a little bit different because now we're saying, I don't necessarily care who your manager is. What I more or less care about is what is your title? So, what is your job functionality inside my organization? And so from that standpoint, now you're just giving everybody a position. So you would go in and configure the positional hierarchy for your organization. So you would say, okay, my VP of sales and service report to my CEO, my managers report to my VP of sales, my salespeople report to my sales manager. I don't necessarily care which sales manager, I just know that they report to my sales managers. And because of that, in this case, now you would have a situation where sales managers are basically direct reports of the VP of sales. So because of that, the VP of sales would have read, write, append to access to all of the sales manager information. And as you work your way down the chain, your non-direct reports, which would basically be your salespeople, I would have read-only access to within those contexts. So these are people that I don't necessarily report to on a day-to-day basis, but they're still part of my chain. Now, let's look and see what that looks like inside the app. So if I set this to custom position hierarchy and now I hit configure, this is a little bit different. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to define what those positions look like inside my organization. So for example, I'm going to go ahead and just create a new position. I'm going to call this my CEO. And I'm going to save and close. Or actually I can hit save. Now in this situation, this is where I would have to say who are the people that have that position. Now I could have 5, 6, 7 people in this position if I wanted to. In this case, we'll just go ahead and add the CRM admin to this position. And then I will close out of here. And then we'll add a new position. We'll call this VP Sales, and we'll say that the parent position is the CEO, and save. And in this case, maybe we'll just add myself to that, And then we would continue this process. We'll add one more. We'll call this one managers or sales managers. And we'll do the same thing. We'll add a couple of different users to this one. So we'll say sales managers. And we'll make the parent position the VP of sales. We'll save it. And we'll add Tony Smith. And then we'll just do one more. Call this sales. And the users in this position are train user 1 and train user 2. Now, the advantage to this is the fact that I'm saying I don't necessarily care who the users are, but this is the organizational structure that I want to work with. And now the advantage to this also is the fact that this is also going to use kind of non-business unit territory situation. So it doesn't matter who belongs to what business unit. If they are considered a salesperson and they're in sales in that situation, they are considered a direct report to anybody who is a sales manager. Doesn't matter what business unit those sales managers belong to. So now any sales manager would now have access to any salesperson's information. And so this is where now you can really take this on top of what you already have from a security structure and really give yourself some more specialized circumstances where you can start using this and applying this when you're moving forward. When it comes to using security from a Dynamics 365 standpoint, sometimes you're going to just find that the out-of-the-box, business unit security role structure isn't going to give you everything that you need to have from within the context of that application. And so you may find that you need to extend that functionality out just a little bit to be able to facilitate that. And that's really where the hierarchy security can come into play, because it gives you the ability to actually have a little bit more granular access to what it is that you want to do. You can base it more off of positional or managerial access, now providing more detailed access to all of the entities that those direct reports or non-direct reports might have from within the context of the application. Now remember, there's two types. There's the managerial and there's the positional. With managerial access, the managers do have to reside in the same business unit or at least in a parent business unit of the person who is directly or indirectly reporting to them or who they manage. But as soon as you have access to those individual situations, if they're a direct report, you have complete read-write access. If they're an indirect report, you are going to have write or read-only access to the information. With positional security, you do have the capabilities now to span business units. It's the same concept. It's whoever is directly reporting or indirectly reporting to you, but it's more at a what position have you been assigned within the application itself. The big thing to remember is while the application does allow you to have up to 100 levels in the hierarchy, they really only recommend going no more than 4 deep, because there's additional filtering that has to be processed in order for that to work, and the additional processing based upon how many people you manage could have some performance implications on the people higher up in the chain. But it's still an excellent model, particularly positional if you need to span multiple business units, to just provide a nice extension to the already flexible functionality that's there from a security standpoint within Dynamics 365.